Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mast, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm also joined by my colleague here, Mr. Roy. There will be some colloquy going between us as we each feel the need to discuss what's going on in Israel right now, the response by the world, the response by the United States of America. And Mr. Roy, I don't know if you have any opening comments that you'd like to begin with, but we can certainly start with that.
Well, I would just say how much I appreciate the gentleman, appreciate his service, appreciate his understanding about how important Israel is to us as an ally and how important it is for our country to stand united right now as we watch our friends under attack. And I look forward to engaging with him and would yield back.
Yeah, let's start with what my friend just said, our friends under attack. That first word, under attack, is the most important part to realize here. And I want to quote one of our other colleagues in a statement, Ms. Omar, in one of her statements about these very events. She said, Israel airstrikes killing civilians in Gaza is an act of terrorism. Palestinians deserve protection. Unlike Israel, missile defense programs such as Iron Dome don't exist to protect Palestinian civilians. It's unconscionable to not condemn these attacks. That's absolutely right. Palestinians don't receive support like Iron Dome. That would be akin to giving Al-Qaeda or ISIS or the Taliban U.S. bomb technicians and military personnel to help them out. That would be the apples-to-apples comparison of giving the attackers, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, others. That would be the equivalent of giving them those kind of assets. Hamas purposefully makes their civilians the shields to their offensive points. That's not hyperbole. Think about that, what they do to their population. I don't want to just speak about this in platitudes. And if you have anything to add, by all means, I'll just yield to you as that time arises. I want to speak about these by specific incident to say exactly how much Israel is being attacked. And let the American people judge who is the aggressor here. We'll go over both rocket attacks, which are acts of terrorism, and suicide bombings. And I'm not even going to read, you might think I'm reading every one of them in history, but I'm not. They're all serious, but I'm reading what largely became the most serious of them. We'll start just now with the rocket attacks. I'm not going to read for today because the totals aren't in, but as of yesterday, over 600 rockets were launched into Israel. When I say 600 rockets, I don't want people to think they're small, the size of this table or my cane. We're talking about Fahar 5 rockets. They're made by Iran. They're 21 feet long. That's basically a little bit longer than a Chevy Suburban. The warheads on these rockets are about 90 kilograms or 200 pounds of explosives. To put that into perspective, what detonated underneath my feet when I lost my legs was probably somewhere around 5 to 10 pounds. So each of these warheads being fired in somewhere around 200 pounds of explosives. So just yesterday, 600 rockets. May 9, 6 rockets. April 25, 5 rockets. April 24, 2 rockets. April 23, 36 rockets. April 15, 1 rocket. January 20, 1 rocket. January 18, 2 rockets. Going back into 2020, December 26, 2 rockets. November 21, 1 rocket. November 14, 2 rockets. October 22, 2 rockets. October 16, 1 rocket. September 15, 13 rockets. August 21, 12 rockets. August 16, 2 rockets. August 2, 1 rocket. July 5, 3 rockets. June 26, 2 rockets. June 15, 1 rocket. February 23 and 24, 90 rockets over the course of that Sunday and Monday. Moving into 2019, November 12, 190 rockets launched by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. May 5, 200 rockets. May 4, 250 rockets. March 25th, 1 rocket. March 14th, 2 rockets. Going back into 2018, November 12, 1 mortar. November 11, 17 rockets. August 8, 8 rockets. July 26, 11 rockets. July 14, 174 rockets. Barrage, Israel. And we're talking about, let's put this into perspective as well, a country roughly the size of the state of New Jersey, not the breadth of the United States of America.
Has the gentleman traveled to Israel?
Many times.
And is the gentleman aware that even when it's the size of New Jersey, really the population center is really in an area pretty much the size of probably about a quarter of New Jersey or half of New Jersey, right? And so they're facing at all times in Lebanon, for example, there's about 150,000 rockets sitting there pointing at this space between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in the northern part of Israel, where virtually all of the population lives, of all walks of faith, by the way, and that they are under constant threat, and without Iron Dome would be in grave danger as they're taking this rocket fire that they're taking from the Gaza Strip today.
You're exactly right. And we've both had the honor of spending time there. I have had the honor in my life of wearing 2 military uniforms for a dozen years in the U.S. Army, and also for a period wearing the uniform of the Israel Defense Forces. And one of the things that I learned so well in my time spent serving there was what I feel the same way about as a father of 4. When you go over there and you get to the weekend and the time for Shabbat dinner, each family over there, because everybody serves, as they get their family together for that Shabbat meal, every family is waiting for a son, a daughter, a grandson, a granddaughter to come home from that weekend from their service that everybody is mandated to perform, and that in all likelihood during some time in their service, they will probably have to wield their weapon in defense of Israel, given the percentages of the times that they find themselves under attack.
As you've been watching over the last several weeks with our friends in Israel under attack, particularly this week, with the amount of missiles that are going in, there has been wide success, obviously, with Iron Dome, but obviously that puts a continued stress on Iron Dome. And as the gentleman concerned as I am, that we have this country standing alongside Israel to ensure that they've got the resources they need, that they can continue to have a strong Iron Dome, continue to be able to push back on the rockets that are being fired into Israel from Gaza Strip by Hamas.
Could not agree more, and to put in perspective why, a great American word, Alamo. Mm-hmm. Israel is really, it's an Alamo in the Middle East of freedom, democracy, human rights for all people. That's what they are in that region. And if we don't stand for them, for that friend, that great ally in this region, who do we stand for?
And I'm a proud representative of San Antonio, Texas, where our Alamo stands. And so I appreciate that reference. Is the gentleman aware that there has been numerous casualties, numerous deaths as a result of this rocket fire, very specifically including non-Israeli citizens? In fact, I saw some social media yesterday of a young Indian woman, from the country of India, who was killed while visiting Israel. And there have been numerous others, children and others that have lost their lives, and also, thousands upon thousands of Israeli farmland that has been torched and burned, livelihoods that have been put into disarray as a result of this rocket fire. Does the gentleman agree with that?
Totally agree. Let's make a perspective on that as well.
Please.
I just went over a tremendous list of years of rocket attacks. Now, when Israel goes and flies over the Gaza Strip and puts a piece of ordnance on a target, it's because that location is where they were firing rockets from. They are defending themselves. That's very specifically, it's the definition of defense. All of those rockets and mortars being lobbed into Israel, those are fired entirely indiscriminately beyond, say, they're trying to send them in an area. They're not trying to send those rockets in to land and take down a date tree or some other kind of farm field or something like that. Their specific intent is to indiscriminately hit the largest centers of population and anybody or any piece of infrastructure, whether it's related to military, civilians, restaurants, you name it, they don't care. It is the definition of indiscriminate killing.
Is the gentleman aware that there have been numerous people who have thrown out the phrase that Israel, many of our friends, by the way, that Israel has a right to defend itself, right? And we hear this regularly. Would the gentleman agree that Israel has more than a right to defend itself, but rather a duty and, in fact, responsibility to defend itself, defend the people of Israel, and to stand strong as what you just described, the greatest democracy in the Middle East, with a plurality of individuals in that country who respect freedom and democracy in a multi-ethnic population, even as we are, as a result of my belief of the previous administration, experiencing a renaissance in Middle East potential peace, we're seeing the response to that here, if the gentleman would agree.
I would respond to the gentleman by saying, what greater calling for any government, what greater responsibility for any government than to protect its people? You speak in length about the protection that the United States of America owes to its people on the southern border. It's one of the things that you address so regularly, and that carries over to what we're speaking about right here. And I would add on this point simply to that. When I go back in time and say, what brought about me going over to put on the uniform of the IDF? I was a student in Boston, and at that time, a recent Gaza war was going on back in 2014. And what I witnessed there, aside from people that were protesting Israel, again, for going out there and defending herself, were people also seeing U.S. service members like myself. They were out there to protest Israel, but they started harassing people like me and my family because they could see I was a U.S. service member. And so that goes to the jump that they make when they layer the United States and Israel next to one another. But what I said to myself after those experiences was, this makes absolutely no sense. This is total hypocrisy. If any one of our neighbors, Mexico, some Caribbean country, Canada, started lobbing rockets or lobbing mortars into the United States of America, my friends in the service would go and eliminate those enemies. And everybody in the United States of America would be grateful to them for doing so. And how we do not afford that same right to Israel, or some of our colleagues do not, is absolutely beyond me.
Would the gentleman be surprised if I told him that on my first trip to Israel in 2014, May, I believe, that we were able to take a helicopter tour of the north end of Israel, as I described earlier, where the bulk of the population is, and fly up the Jordan River and go up to the northern part of Israel, and that we would have been able to experience visiting a hospital in Israel where Israeli doctors, Jewish doctors, were caring for, at the time, the gentleman will remember in 2014, what was going on in Syria and the devastating toll that the Syrian regime was having on its own people, and that there were children and women and those that were being attacked in their own country in Syria, who were receiving top-notch, the best medical care in the world in Israeli hospitals, and then Israelis secreting them back to Syria and not making it public so that there would be no reprisal taken on, against these Syrians because they had gone to get care in Israel. Would the gentleman be surprised by that based on his experience and his service in the Israeli Defense Forces?
Not surprised in the slightest. And we've seen this not just go on for those that were wounded in Syria and other places. We can see it right here in our own area of the world, where Israel responded to the earthquake in Haiti and other natural disasters around the globe. They are often among the first on the ground to go out there and respond. The gentleman has spoke about his time in Israel, and we've spoke about some of these rocket attacks. And again, I don't want to live in the ambiguous here. I want to speak to exactly what has gone on in history. And I'm now going to move at this point to some of the suicide bombings that have taken place in the state of Israel and go through some of those. 2016, bus bombing, 20 injured. Hamas takes credit. Now, before I continue with just saying Hamas takes credit or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, it's important to have perspective on that as well, that in 2006, Hamas is not just a terrorist organization. In 2006, they became the majority elected government for the Palestinian Authority. So when people talk about a two-state solution, you're talking about Hamas, that I'm going to speak about in length here, being the government entity that would be that second state. Let's continue on. We'll go to 2006 here. Rosh Hashanah restaurant bombing, 11 killed, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Hasharon Mall, December 2005, 5 killed, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Market bombing, October 26, 7 killed, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Mall bombing, July 12, 2005, 5 killed, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Club bombing, February 25 in Tel Aviv. Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade and Hezbollah involvement. Bus bombing, January 29, 2004, Jerusalem, 11 killed, Hamas. Liberty Bell parking bus bombing, February 22, 8 killed, Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade. Ashdod Port Massacre, March 14, 2004, 10 killed, in a double suicide bombing carried out by, again, Hamas. Beersheba bus bombing, August 31, 2004, 16 killed. Hamas claims responsibility. And again, I'm reading to you just a small portion of all of the attacks that I could read to you. Haifa bus 37, suicide bombing, March 5, 2003, 17 killed. Bus station massacre, January 5, 2003, in Tel Aviv, 23 killed. Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. Mike's Place, suicide bombing, a pub, April 30, 2003, 3 killed, Hamas. Gross Square attack, May 17, 2003, 2 killed, Hamas. Jerusalem, bus number 6 bombing, 7 killed. Hamas claims responsibility. Davidka Square bus bombing, June 11, 2003, 17 killed. Hamas claims responsibility. And the list could go on. I don't know if you'd care to comment on any of this as I could continue year after year with these suicide attacks, the stabbings, the bombings, the vehicular manslaughter, the rocket attacks. It goes on and on.
I would say to the gentleman that my response is that I could go through a similar list, and the gentleman has done that perfectly well. What I was struck by in my time in Israel, and that was particularly in the summer of 2019, as I already described in May of 2014, the extent to which the people of Israel were so grateful, one, for the United States' support in working with them on Iron Dome in order to have the technology, and not just Iron Dome, David Sling and all the various different technologies that they're using, to be able to live. And to be able to live in less fear. And their ability, by the way, to build a fence, to build a infrastructure and border in order to prevent traffic and people coming in that might wish to do them harm, and the extent to which they would tell stories about loved ones that each and every one of them had lost in one of these suicide bombings or some other attack. But that how gratified they were that many of these things were things they were talking about in the past. And that Israel was moving forward and being able to live in peace and to be able to live without fear of those kinds of attacks as much. And I would just question whether the gentleman would agree that I don't necessarily always believe in coincidences when we have an administration who refuses to even call Prime Minister Netanyahu for the first 40 or 50 days of the administration. We have an administration that was more interested in sitting down with Iran than sitting down with our friends in Israel, that we might see that some of our enemies, our mutual enemies, are emboldened to engage in this kind of attack.
I could not agree more with the gentleman. It is important that we acknowledge the truth. Who are our friends? Who are our enemies? Who are those that are posing a threat? What is the threats that they are posing? And we make that known. That has an effect on the saber rattling. And we should take the saber rattling that goes on, whether it's in Iran or whether it's in a Palestinian-controlled territory or Syria or anywhere else. We need to take that seriously. And to your point about that pride that you saw in that friendship between the U.S. and Israel, on a separate experience. Again, in Israel, I believe this was in 2017 for myself. I'm with my wife. We're down on the Sea of Galilee with other members of Congress. And literally, inside of a restaurant filled simply with patrons of that area, the patrons in that restaurant stood up, and to us that were members of Congress, the United States House of Representatives, bipartisan group, and they sang "God Bless America." Yeah. I would challenge anybody. Would you agree that we could find many places across the globe where we would be hard-pressed to find a group of restaurant patrons that would stand and sing twice, in my experience, God bless America.
Well, the gentleman recounts something that I experienced as well, and more than that, a heartfelt then description of the reasons that the Israelis are so thankful for our friendship and our support, and their belief, I believe rightfully so, that the United States relationship with Israel is a significant part of their ability to exist as a nation, particularly under the intense scrutiny and attack that they find themselves. And here we are, I think 73 years now since, and I think this Friday will be the 73rd anniversary of Israeli independence. I think I'm right about that. I just pulled that out of my head. And that almost now 75 years is, I think, in direct connection to America's support. And it, of course, has ebbed and flowed over the years. But that support, and that particularly strong support with President Trump moving the embassy to Jerusalem, I believe that the people of Israel rightfully recognize that support as key to their security and safety, if the gentleman agrees.
I totally agree. But it didn't stop with moving the embassy to Jerusalem. It had to do with acknowledging, is Iran a friend or an enemy? And reversing what had gone on with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, moving away from Iran, moving back towards our consistent friend and ally, Israel. It had more to do with going out there and recognizing the relationships that we have through our cross-military training exercises that we do, sharing of military technologies, and so on and so on. It didn't just end with acknowledging something that everybody knew for decades, since the beginning of Israel. Where is the capital? That was an important piece of it for the president to make that acknowledgement. But it went so far beyond. Would the gentleman agree?
Well, and I appreciate it. I do agree with the gentleman. I might say to the speaker, in order to be deferential to my friend's time, if I might ask how much time remains in our half an hour. 8 minutes total. I thank the speaker. I would agree with the gentleman. I would add a couple of other thoughts. I noticed today a tweet on May 11th, which would be yesterday, by Supreme Leader Khamenei, Iran, quote, "Palestinians are awake and determined. They must continue this path. One can only talk with the language of power with these criminals, i.e. Israelis. They must increase their strength, stand strong, confront the enemy being, of course, Israel, and force them to stop their crimes." Would the gentleman agree that Iran is certainly responsible and tied to the supply of rockets, technology to Hamas that is being targeted towards our friends in Israel, and that we must remember where Iran stands with respect to Israel and the United States?
I thank the gentleman for his question. And I could continue on through this list and read year after year: 9 killed, 6 killed, 14 killed, 11 killed. And as I read Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, and Hezbollah in that list as well. And the list goes on year after year after year. And as you look at those threats and those calls to violence, it begs the question. I can't take credit for this quote. I forget who exactly said it first, but they said, you don't sell a gun to somebody that wants to shoot you. And this was the failed policy that President Trump worked to correct in reversing from that relationship with Iran and strengthening that relationship with Israel. Would the gentleman agree?
I would agree, and I think that it's critically important to remember who we're dealing with and who we empower at the expense of both our national security and the national security of our friends in Israel. I would also offer a tweet that I saw from his home base in Qatar. The Hamas political director and literal United States designated terrorist, Ismail Haniyeh, tweets his support of the attacks on Israel. This individual notes, and I don't know that we need to get into cancel culture, but this individual notes that he won't be banned from Twitter. And I think this is something that we should all be cognizant of as we're looking around the world, when we remember that in the previous administration, President Trump's policies, that we were seeing extraordinary gains in peace in the Middle East. Arab countries recognizing Israel, opening up flights and engagement between Israel and countries that before would not recognize them. Does the gentleman agree with that?
Thank you for your question. Not only do I agree with that, but I think one of the most important points that we make on that is that it was without concession. We didn't have to negotiate. The president did not negotiate or barter a deal that says, listen, you need to go out there and submit to another authority that is bombing you, sending mortars, sending rockets, kidnapping people from your territory. You don't have to submit to some other authority in that in order to have this peace. It was a negotiated peace based upon a truth, and I believe an acknowledgement by those other nations of exactly what has been read off here today. The historical documentation of rocket attacks, mortar attacks, suicide bombings that point to the fact that Israel is not the aggressor. They show a tremendous amount of restraint year after year after year. The fact that their enemies that attack them are not simply a smoldering pile of ashes at this point is demonstration of the restraint. I don't know that if we had that kind of history that our enemy would not be a smoldering pile of ashes.
I would agree with the gentleman. I would suggest that the gentleman made the point best earlier when he said, how would we respond in the United States of America if this many missiles were being fired from Mexico, where, by the way, we have cartels who are operating control of our border? If we had literally, and here's some of the data, the gentleman quoted some data, here's some from my staff, more than 1,500 missiles, possibly 700 already, I think the gentleman alluded to, in the last 72 hours on average every 3 minutes by Hamas. 200 of the rockets fired fell short of crossing the border and caused civilian damage. IDF targeting military PIJ and Hamas infrastructure, the operatives and the rocket launchers. An Iron Dome battery was operationalized from reserves. IDF thwarted an attack by an elite Hamas unit, which is trying to dig a tunnel into Israel. And now you've got the Palestinian Islamic Jihad Quds Brigade saying, quote, it will expand the ring of fire and target Tel Aviv and after Tel Aviv with huge rocket barrage. That this is the state of things in Israel. And that, to the gentleman's point, and I'll yield back, no American would be sitting here today if I'm sitting here in Austin, Texas, or San Antonio, Texas, about 150 miles from the western end over to Mexico. If we had 1,500 rockets firing in on San Antonio or Austin, look, man, I'd be grabbing my weapons and I'd be heading down to the border and we'd be taking care of business. I mean, this is the reality of what we're talking about. So when I hear people saying Israel has a right to defend itself, it has a duty, a responsibility to defend itself. And I support them fully, and I would yield back to the gentleman.
And by my calculation, we should have about 2 minutes remaining. And so I'll try to give you the last word in just a moment. I would just bring us back to what I opened up with for myself here. And that was the tweet, the statement. It was put out in a number of places by our colleague who I am absolutely astounded sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee with me, Representative Omar, that Palestinians deserve protection and that Israel is somehow the aggressor committing an act of terrorism, and ask that the American people go out there, do your own research, look up what the history is, look at the attacks, see what's going on, and judge that for yourself in the most honest way that you can. And I will give the remaining time to the gentleman from Texas.
Well, I think